All right, how you guys doing? So I had pretty much planned for this to be a little interactive. It seems the way the mic's set up, we might have to be a little inventive with that. I've gone through. Fred has been kind enough to share with me the list of podcasters and the finalists. By the way, can anyone hear me? Like, if you guys can hear me, just raise your hand so I make sure I'm not talking into the void. Oh, okay, perfect. You guys can hear me. Lovely. All right. So from what I've gathered, a lot of you guys are early stage podcasters. I'm not too sure how far most of your guys have got with either your podcasting or developing your customer journey and stuff like that. So I think ideally it would be helping you guys address any pain points you have. So Fred, I don't know what the best way to go about it would be, but maybe just addressing a few questions and then I can go. So if there are 2 to 3 major questions or queries that you guys have with regards to developing your podcast audience and making it sustainable or with revenue streams, please ask away and then I'll try my best to answer and then also contextualize it for what you guys are doing in your specific market.
Anyone with questions? If you have a question, I request you stand close to this fantastic contraption just to make it more audible from the side. Maybe, Phil, we can begin with, is it necessary to begin a podcast with a commercial aspect in mind? What if we're just doing it just for vibes and as a hobby? Do we have to begin one just with that commercialization in mind?
I would say I would definitely say don't start a podcast to make money. You will be sorely disappointed. That's the first thing. In college, our lecturers always used to say, if you solve a problem for one person, you'll solve a problem for many. You just need to figure out how to solve that problem. So ideally, like with Two Broke Twimbos, the reason why we started that podcast was at the time I was writing the African Hip Hop blog, and we were mainly doing short, medium, and sometimes long form written content specifically around the music industry. But there wasn't anything like that outside of just hip hop, and there certainly wasn't like that in long form conversation. I was researching artists or researching for interviews, or the majority of the content you'd find would be radio interviews, which are very short form. And if you guys are familiar with commercial radio, it's usually cut into 5 to 15-minute blocks because they've always got to cut to ads, they've got to play a song, they've got to keep listeners engaged. And on the flip side, I was coming across really entertaining long form content from American podcasters. I was like, why don't I do this for Africa? So that's what we were doing. And we didn't necessarily have an ingrained audience. We literally started from scratch. Obviously, there was a bit of carryover from the audience I had for my blog and my social media presence. But obviously, you're not slicing that because those people that follow you may follow you for a very specific reason. And that may not be your cultural takes or your ability to conduct interviews. So the first 4 years of podcasting was really just for the fun of it. And it was very capital intensive. Thank God I had a job that was able to help subsidize those costs. So all the equipment that we were using for podcasting was either being paid for by myself or through my podcast host who was working at a radio station, and they were kind enough to let us use the radio when no one was recording. It was only after then, when I went back to business school, that I then figured out how I could probably start monetizing and figuring ways to make it work. And even then, the major source of revenue for us and the consistent source of revenue for us is through our listeners and our fans. So our Patreon is what covers the bills. That's what allows us to at least pay our producer, pay overheads, and put a little bit of change in our pocket so that we can attend events, etc. And maybe if we're lucky, buy a pair of sneakers at the end of the year. But outside of that, it's not going to be a life-changing amount of money. When brands do come knocking, it's very inconsistent. So brands may come 2 to 3 times a quarter, and those campaigns can run any from any length from 1 month to 3 months. But when you stretch that out over 12 months of operation, you really can't forecast for that. So ideally, the first thing is fit your podcasting into your daily routine the same way you would journal, the same way maybe if you had a blog that you were doing as a passion project, that's what your podcast ideally should be. And also consume as much podcast content as you can to understand how people are doing it. things that ideas you can adapt from, ideas you could pivot away from. Like, okay, these guys do this. I really don't want to do that for my listeners. Let me do the opposite. These guys are doing this. Let me see how I can make it work. That's kind of how you learn and you build a skill. And eventually, what that also allowed us to do was it became almost a B2B service offering. So now do consulting for brands and podcasters looking to start podcasts or looking to reach customers via this medium. So we get called in and consult on that. I'm lucky enough to get called in by people like Fred, who also need help with spreading the word about podcasting initiatives continentally. And then also just helping brands figure out how to reach audiences and how to engage with them outside of just traditional above the line media. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. I have a question here. What are the characteristics of a global or international podcast?
So was that Bill?
International. What are the characteristics of a global or international podcast?
Oh, global international podcast. I would say that's very vague. I mean, the simplest answer to that is open any podcast up and see what podcasts are being featured. Um, those are the ones that are being put front and center. So a lot of those featured lists are a combination of um, analytical editorial numbers and editorial selection. What that means is there'll always be a hybrid of what the specific editors or people in charge of those platforms deem noteworthy or what they want to push. So they might like true crime podcasts and they're like, yo, we want a lot of people focusing on these true crime podcasts. We think these podcasts are amazing. Let's put them on the front page. Let's feature them. Let's put a banner, make sure people engage with them, because all these podcast apps are fighting for your attention and time. The more time you spend within the app, the better it is for the podcast apps, specifically podcast apps that do direct ad insertion. We can come back to that later, because I think that's also something you guys need to understand, is like the technologies used within podcasting. So there's that, and then obviously then there's podcasts that are just topping the charts. How those are measured varies. Apple have changed the way that they track podcasting a couple of times, but ideally, how they used to track it was downloads, recurring downloads. So one of the hacks in the early days of podcasting was if you just released your podcast daily, you'd always find yourself at number one, because iTunes would count the amount of times people downloaded your podcast, and every time they download your podcast, that would add to your ranking. So if you released one episode once a week, or you cut it into 7 different parts of the same episode once every day, the 7 different parts would boost you up the rankings, because iTunes would figure, wait a minute, there's a lot of demand for this podcast because people are downloading it daily, without accounting for the fact that people are getting the same content. It's just been spread out over time. But ultimately, with regards to quality of podcast, I think just listen to the big ones. For the most part, the big podcasts are adopting the best practices. They have the best studio equipment. They have the best producers. They have the best equipment. So that's ideally what you need to do. But for the most part, you don't need a lot. We used to do our podcast with a Zoom H4n and 2 microphones that I bought for $40 on Amazon many years ago, and that was more than enough. What you do need to invest in is understanding how to edit the audio. It's a lot easier these days, but if you're going to try and make your podcast sound global, obviously the first thing would be investing in good software to edit your podcasts. The equipment isn't as important as it used to be. And then understanding how to structure your podcast from a production, as a producer and production standpoint. So what's our intro? What's our hook? How do we structure our conversations? Is this a narrative podcast? Is it 2 individuals talking? Is it a round table discussion? And formatting it that way so that it's engaging to the listener. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. Any questions? Anyone? When promoting your podcasts, would you advise going organic or running things like ads and sponsored posts on social media?
Organic by far and away is the best. We never ran ads for at least 4 years. I think We only just started doing video this year. Well, we were doing video before, but video was a loss leader because it was coming out of our pockets, and we weren't getting that money back. So we're just doing it as a passion project. And then when we returned in 2018, our plan was we're going to make sure that this podcast is not only at the very least breaking even, but eventually profitable. Video is very expensive. So once again, if you're running ads, the only engaging ads you were able to run a video. So you now have to consider that you're also in a very saturated market in terms of just global podcasting, but then also how big is your total addressable market? So I don't know if you guys have done stuff like that, but when you're researching what's topics you want to speak on, I would advise figuring out how big your total addressable audience is. If, for example, you're speaking about women's health, your total addressable audience is practically half of the global population, like in theory, and then obviously you start filtering it down to who it specifically it's for. If though you're speaking about the traffic in Nairobi, your total addressable audience is far smaller because it's literally only people who have the experience of traffic in Nairobi, if that makes sense. So, therefore, if your total addressable audience is, for example, 100,000 people, and of those 100,000 people, only 20,000 are actually going to be viable or listeners to your show, doesn't make sense to spend 300 US dollars on ads every month, not only in the um, distribution of those ads, but the production of those ads and then tracking those ads. I would say the best advertising tool you should have, and that's worked really well for us, is word of mouth. If you have a good show, if you have a good product, people are going to want to share it. People are going to want to have discuss around it. There are other ways to help facilitate that. So um, short form video and AI tools make it really, really easy. So now, as opposed to having to hire a video editor, we literally can automate the whole process. All we do is approve. So we've built a workflow that is automated from video production, editing, caption creation, and graphics. And all we do is just approve. Okay, yeah, this video is good. This video is not. This video is good. This video is not. So what would have normally taken us 2-3 hours takes us 30 minutes. And that's really helped with just creating more video. And I think those videos work better as ads than actual ads, because the way video now works, especially with Instagram Reels and TikTok, is they literally just present the consumer or the viewer with every possible thing they could be interested in, and the viewer then decides if they want to engage this content or not. So it doesn't matter how big your following is. If you have one follower but you make a really dope TikTok video that ticks all the right boxes and is engaging for listeners, you could go viral. Then hopefully that virality can convert into listeners for your podcast, or at the very least followers on your page. And then the more followers you have, the easier it is to convert those followers into long form listeners, etc. So there are ways to go around it. I would advise against running ads. Only run ads when it makes financial sense to do so. And by that I mean when your podcast is generating money, or you have advertisers on board, and those advertisers have KPIs that require you to reach a certain amount of plays, impressions, clicks, etc. And if you know you're not going to reach it organically, then by all means buy ads to make sure that you satisfy that advertiser and you reach your goals. But if you're trying to grow your podcast without any revenue, don't spend money. It's a recipe for literally just running out of money quick, because you run yourself ragged trying to reach an audience that you don't understand yet.
Cool. How much goes into building that community and building that loyalty? So, for example, whether it's an audio or video podcast with 10,000 followers or subscribers, and after each episode you get 200 comments, do you reply to all 200 comments to build that loyalty, or how do you go about building that loyal listener fan base?
So obviously it takes a lot of time. It really does take a lot of time in the beginning. You want to engage with every single listener. So whoever leaves a comment, whoever likes your episode enough to share, to retweet, to comment, etc., no matter what the platform, engage with them, thank them. And the moment you do, figure out ways to convert those people from social media followers and engagers to actual names, emails, numbers. That's the most important thing. So always convert your listeners to names, emails, numbers. So I would advise every podcast have at least a WhatsApp group and an email newsletter, and figure out a funnel that's going to get someone who likes your podcast to be a subscriber. If they comment and they say, yo, I really love this episode, thank them and say, yo, thank you so much. Really appreciate the support. Oh, by the way, if you like our stuff, here's a link to our newsletter. If you like our stuff, here's a link to our WhatsApp group. And then upsell them on that. Make sure your WhatsApp group has value. Have discussions in the WhatsApp group that don't necessarily make it to the podcast, or use your WhatsApp group. What we do is we use it as a research, little like a beta test for topics we want to discuss, but also giving our people value. Because in our WhatsApp group, the minimum entry is $5 on our Patreon. So we've got tiers from $5 all the way to 100, and we stack rewards. So at the base is access to the WhatsApp group. At the top tier, we get access to concerts and stuff like that. So we literally just give listeners concerts. We'll just be like, hey, like for example, Janet Jackson was supposed to be in the country in South Africa last month. Listeners in South Africa want to go see Janet Jackson. We've got 4 tickets available. Click this link. The first 4 people to sign up get the tickets. And that creates an incentive so that people want to support. And we found that just by doing that, we've upsold people from the $5 tier all the way to the $50 tier, simply because they see that we're trying to make it a viable experience. So wherever you can, grow the community, but grow the community on a platform you control, which is why I emphasize getting their number and the email address. No matter what happens to the algorithm on TikTok, Instagram, X, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it may be, it doesn't matter if you have their email address and their phone number, because you can reach out to them directly. And that's the most important thing. Once you have that one-to-one relationship, you're not going through an intermediary to reach them. So therefore, you don't really have to run ads anymore, because you're reaching your listeners direct.
Cool, thanks. What strategies have worked for growing and engaging your audience consistently?
I would say if you guys are familiar with the design thinking model, which is essentially a feedback loop of iteration and feedback. So figure out what format you guys, first and foremost, as the podcast creator, what format and what style and what voice your podcast wants to have. And then once you've, even if it's literally 2 listeners, if those 2 listeners are engaged enough, have feedback sessions with them and say, hey guys, what do you like about our show? What don't you like about our show? What should we change? What should we not? And take that information on board and see if you can adjust your strategy. And that's really going to help grow and then iterate. So in the beginning, we just used to do interviews. And then we realized very quickly that the bottleneck with interviews is you were beholding to the guest. So if a guest cancels last minute, you no longer have a show for that week. So then we iterated and we're like, okay, let's build our show to be 2 parts, where we have an interview and then we discuss current events, so that if we don't have an interview that week, we can still do current events. What has happened now is when we started doing our podcast, started doing interviews, by the time, especially today, our biggest episodes aren't with guests. Our biggest episodes are always when it's just me and my co-host, because our listeners come to us for commentary. Some do come for the interviews, but for the most part, it's the commentary, and it works in tandem, because the commentary episodes are great for the short form, the short tail, which is we're discussing stuff that happened this week, last week. So if you want to get caught up on the news, you want to get caught up on our takes, you listen to those episodes and you'll be up to date. Interviews are great because those are almost evergreen. Now, if you want to listen to stuff that we've done, and we've, like, even guys in Kenya, we've done like Kagwe Mungai and Calligraph Jones and King Kaka. If you want to listen to those interviews, just search them and you'll find them. And those are always available. Obviously, things might change, but if you want to get a snapshot into what those artists' mindset was at that point in time, just go to those interviews and they'll be there. So I would say create a feedback loop. Start, of course, just get good at it. Because in the beginning, there's going to be teething problems regardless. You're not going to be good on mic. You're going to struggle with dead space. You're going to struggle with responding to questions. You're going to struggle with editing and recording. You're going to lose a bunch of episodes. Lord knows we've lost tons of episodes where we recorded for hours and we realized, oh, snap, it wasn't recording, or the memory card got corrupted. You're going to learn about how to, like, prepare redundancies and all that stuff. But as you do that, you're going to get better as a podcaster, which is itself going to be a skill, but then also learn to take on feedback from your listeners. And if you don't have any listeners, then that's a big signal that, okay, maybe this isn't working, because if no one's listening to us, why do we keep doing it?
Nice. And sort of in a similar vein, speaking of collaboration, when wanting to collaborate with a different podcast, what kind of criteria do you use or have you used in the past?
Well, that'll be a short answer. I've had the luxury. We literally just collaborate with people we want to collaborate with. So, our philosophy, granted, it might not work for everyone, but if I don't like your podcast, if I don't listen to your podcast, if I don't find it entertaining, we're not going to collaborate with you. It's the same with artists. We've had many artists, or publicists try to pitch us who want to do interviews. If we don't listen to the artist, no matter how big they are, no matter how interesting they may seem, no matter how viral they go, if we don't want to interview you, if we don't like you, if we don't listen to your music, we don't watch your shows, whatever, we're not going to interview. And I think that authenticity has helped us, because our listeners know if these guys are co-signing this person, they must be worth looking into. I would advise that, but I can't obviously force my worldview on everyone else. But in my opinion, editorially, that's how I'd approach it. Don't collaborate or don't do interviews you don't want to do. So collaborate with the people you want to collaborate with. Whether they have one listener or 3,000 listeners doesn't really matter. Like, as long as you're doing that, because at the very least, it allows you to build a network. And especially if you're doing it on YouTube, the way the YouTube algorithm works is it's very automated. So if you speak to anyone from YouTube, and I think you guys in Kenya have access to a lot of the YouTube team, they will tell you that a lot of the stuff that happens with the recommendation engine is all done by the algorithm. All the algorithm does is picks up some signals and then reinforces those signals. So if a podcast page with 20,000 subscribers collabs with a podcast page with 200 subscribers, it's going to start recommending that smaller page to listeners of the bigger page, simply because they collaborated. So, but that also means that there has to be congruency there, because if it starts recommending that content to those other people, and that podcast A, the big podcast, does sports, and podcast B speaks on baking, and you guys did some forced collaboration, when you start recommending the baking to the people that are expecting sports, they're going to click out immediately. And the worst thing that can happen to you on all these algorithmically driven platforms, Spotify, YouTube, and to a certain degree Apple now, because they're doing it too, is if someone listens for 5 to 10 seconds, or with the podcast up to 2 minutes, and then they stop, that's a death knell. That's a signal that's like, people do not like this content, so it's going to downrank you a great deal.
Okay, thanks. And maybe we can end with some technical questions. What affordable tools or software would you recommend for beginners, particularly beginners who are doing audio podcasts?
There's a free Windows tool called Audacity. It's also on Mac. Your Mac is going to come with GarageBand. Use GarageBand. Whatever microphone you can get a hold of, even if it's your phone. Phones are really pretty decent these days. I've done podcasts. Funny enough, I once did a podcast on a plane during a flight with not even AirPods, the AirPods with the cable before they went Bluetooth, and a $20 mic, and it was with two people. So you can do a lot with very cheap equipment. I think a lot of people get caught up in this hype of having to buy expensive equipment and stuff like that. Literally just get a basic sound recorder, get a basic performance mic. You don't even need a condenser mic, and then learn how to edit. So Audacity is free. GarageBand is free. If you happen to be a student and you're lucky enough to get a discount for Adobe, go for it. But Adobe can get a little pricey. But those two tools, that's what we use for the first 4 years of our podcast. We're using that. And then I had Sony SoundForge. I had a license of SoundForge from like 2006. So I was using software that was almost 8 years old at the time, and I still had a license for that, and that worked perfect for what we were doing in the beginning. So literally any piece of software you can right now, I would say use. I would avoid, especially if you're beginning a podcast, using tools that focus on like AI or doing all the heavy lifting for you, because you're not going to understand how to edit a podcast. Do something that's more manual in the beginning so that you can automate it later. So if you don't know what a noise gate is, if you don't know what a high pass filter is, if you don't know the difference between phantom 48-volt power and 12-volt power on your microphone, if you don't understand the tolerance you should be recording your waveforms in between 12 and 24 decibels, stuff like that, you're going to struggle. Because if you then offload that to producer, one, you're not going to be able to build a workflow for that producer. And that's another thing, technical thing that is really important, is we literally have like it's almost 15 pages, a document of just like what the podcast is, what we do, how we record episodes, how we do our show notes, and then the workflow for editing the podcast, how to ingest the audio, how to mix it, etc, etc. And the reason we do that isn't necessarily for us because we know it, it's for when we hire producers. So every time we hire one, granted we haven't had much changeover, we've only had like 4 producers in our tenure. We literally just hand them the document and like, go through this. This has everything you need to know. If you have questions, come back to us. And that at least guarantees that there's consistency throughout. So whether I'm editing or Freddie's editing the podcast, whatever, there's going to be consistency in the quality of the audio because it's the same process being followed throughout. So on a technical standpoint, I would advise make sure you understand the workflow of how you record, write it down, and make sure you adhere to it. And then when you can, find someone else to adhere to it. But in the beginning of your podcast, you have to be the person recording. You have to be the person doing the show notes. You have to be the person editing it. If you don't understand how these processes work, you are offboarding that to someone else, which puts you in a disadvantageous position because one, you won't understand how to do it. And B, you're going to be paying for that. And if you're not paying cash, you're going to be paying in other ways. And that's going to cost you in the long run.
Super. Maybe just to wrap up, in the room we have 11 teams of contestants participating in this competition. The winner will be selected next week. What sort of word of advice would you share with all of the contestants in the room regarding the podcast itself, the ideas, whether they win, whether they don't win? What would you want them to take away from this journey they're beginning and embarking on?
I don't think we've won. I think we've won awards. We never won a competition. So firstly, like, I mean, whoever wins, you're gonna have more competition wins than I've ever had. So congrats. I would say the most important thing is like building a community. The only way new media succeeds is building communities and people working together and people leveraging resources. So, and I think that's one thing you guys should not take for granted. And one thing that really is beautiful, like if you look at developed podcast markets, right? America, UK, wherever it may be, they all leverage resources. Even from like the Vine creator days, all the Vine creators used to just get one big house and they'd all share the rent in this massive house and they'd all create in that house. And that meant that everyone had distributed the risk amongst each other. And I think you guys have the same opportunity here where if you guys can figure out how to do that, where one person is able to help with the logistics, one person is able to help with access to a studio, one person is able to help with access to equipment, one person is able to be the technical director or the sound engineer, maybe one person can be the long-term editor, stuff like that, then it makes everyone's jobs easier. Or at the very least, just build a community where you guys can start sharing ideas and sharing information. Like, hey guys, this is what's going on here. Oh, there's a grant available, or this program has just gone live here, or this is what's happening globally with iHeartMedia, and how does this affect us here in Kenya? Or this is happening in South Africa. Like, can we tap into these resources and stuff like that? I think that's the most important thing. Is don't feel like you should be selfish with information. I think that's the mistake a lot of creatives, not just I think just in general, sometimes creatives kind of feel like the idea is the important thing. As someone who also runs an agency, I can tell you this, ideas are very commodified. People steal ideas every day. I get paid to execute on an idea, and that's the value. Like any person that you bump into in the street might actually have an idea for a podcast. How many of those people can actually execute on their idea? And it's a lot hard. I think those of you guys that have started podcasts know it's a lot harder to actually record a podcast. Like it's very easy to talk trash with your friends and be funny when you guys are sitting around, having some nyama choma and some beers or whatever. But turn the mics on and be funny, and like you'll see people clam up. That's the value of it. So leverage each on each other's resources, leverage on each other's strengths, and work together. Don't try and do it alone.
Nice. So sorry, before we let you leave, just one more question. At what point is your audience primed enough to introduce paid for content, communities or spaces?
When they're already paying for your content. So your audience will tell you they are ready to pay for your stuff, and there are many ways to do it. So like what we used to do is, and we still do it, is we just wear like branded stuff, and we'd have branded mugs, and we wouldn't say anything, we just wear it, right? When your audience starts saying, yo, I want to buy that mug, oh, okay, they're willing to spend money on it. So, and you can start seeding it that way. I also think that, especially like as Africans, we need to be wary of the over capitalization. And I'm talking capitalization as in capitalism of the creative industries, because I personally hate it. Is people like try to milk audiences for everything that they're worth. And then eventually, if you milk something for everything it's worth, eventually it's going to run dry. So offer your audience what they want. If your audience wants to support you with merch, and by buying merch, give them the merch. You know what I mean? Figure out a way to sell it to them at a reasonable price. Figure out a way to make it profitable for you to keep the podcast going, etc. Also, be honest with your audience. There's a podcast network called This Week in Tech. That's one of the first podcasts I ever listened to 15, 16 years ago. And they used to be a very expensive operation, and they've whittled down to basically recording at home. And the owner of that network literally was like, hey guys, it was very transparent. Our operation is 7 million a month, a year. We are not able to reach that anymore because podcast revenue has dwindled. So we're reducing it. And all we're asking in return is, can you please give us $7 a month to help us offset these costs? And that level of transparency was really beneficial, because the audience understood, okay, this is what we need to do to keep this thing we like going. Let's keep it going. If you treat your audience like almost like partners, and you have those discussions with them, for the most part, if they care and they've built that parasocial relationship with you, they will respond. So ask them, like, if you want to know the right time to start doing paid for things, have that conversation with your audience. You can just speak in the mic and say, hey, at the end of the episode, hey guys, we're trying to figure out ways to increase revenue. We're thinking of doing A, B, C, D, E. Please let us know in the comments, or via our email, or via our WhatsApp, or our Twitter page, whatever, what you guys think if we introduce this, and this. And that's going to help you in two ways. A, it's going to help you identify who's listening to your podcast, because they're going to respond. And B, it's going to give you the answer you're looking for. And once you get the answers from the people that you know are responding, you can start converting them to phone numbers and emails again. So it's that loop again. Because ultimately, you want to get as many listeners as you can converted into emails and names and numbers.
Wow, that's been insightful. That's been fantastic. Please, can we appreciate Phil one more time?
Yeah.
In case you can't hear, they're clapping overwhelmingly. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate your wisdom, your experience. Whenever you're in Nairobi, please give us a shout. We can put something together just to meet in person. And whenever any of us are in Zim, we can reach out as well.
Oh, don't. I love that. I think I should be there next month, actually. I might be there next month.
Nice. Karibu Kenya, and thanks again so much for taking the time.
All right, no, thank you guys. I appreciate you having me. And if you guys have any other questions, please don't be afraid to reach out. I'm sure Fred will share my email and social media, but my email and my social media is my name, literally Phil Chard, or philchard.com. Love to see how you guys are progressing. Do send links, and we'll see how we can support each other.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much.